Hello and welcome to the Chop Shop. My name is Dion Tucker, and yes, I have on a different hat. In this video, I'm going to discuss flutter tonguing and growling. What's the difference between the two sounds and how do we go about executing them? Flutter tonguing and growling can be tricky techniques to explain and execute on the trombone, so I'm going to do my best here in this video. Fortunately, I spent 12 years with the Duke Ellington Orchestra, and I picked up a lot of tips and tricks along the way, so I'll share a few of those here with you today. Before we jump into that, I want to send a big thank you out there to everybody who's been supporting the channel. Shortly before making this video, we hit the 2,000 subscriber mark here on YouTube, and I can't thank you all enough for your support and love. In the upcoming weeks, I got some exciting announcements for you, so make sure you stay tuned. In the meantime, if you want to support the channel, go ahead and click that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you can get a heads up on whenever I put out a new video. Now, you probably heard me mention Duke Ellington earlier in this video, and his orchestra is largely responsible for revolutionizing some of these techniques that I'm talking about. Now, the father of this technique on the trombone is Joe Tricky Sam Nanton. Tricky Sam Nanton was Duke Ellington's trombone player from the late 30s to the mid 1940s, and he had the ability to make the trombone sound like somebody was talking. And I remember as a young player listening to this and really trying to figure out what exactly he was doing. And somebody told me, yeah, he's humming when he plays. So when you add the sound of the hum with the plunger, you really get a vocal sound on the horn. So with the hum open horn, it sounds like. But when you add the plunger, you get a totally different quality. Now you can hear that hum in there, and it makes a lot more sense when you have the plunger in front of the bell, because it really, especially when you close the plunger, it can sound like somebody saying ow. So there's another mute we can add to the mix when we're dealing with growling, and that's the Pixie Mute. Now, the Pixie Mute is just a metal mute that was made to imitate the sound that Tricky Sam came up with. He actually used a trumpet straight mute, but the Pixie Mute is made and designed for the trombone and trumpet also. And I took the stem out. There's a little stem that goes inside here, but when you take the stem out, it helps you add a little bit more volume. It's a little more free blowing. Now, the hum added with the Pixie Mute sounds like. And because the mute is taking away from the volume, you can hear how I have to hum a little bit louder. Now, when I add the plunger to that, we can definitely get into that vocal quality that Tricky Sam made so popular. So you'll hear me humming in there, and that's how I get the. Now you'll see if you have to play over a band or something like that, it's going to be really hard to hum loud and get the note out of there. So that's where flutter tonguing comes in handy. So let's talk about flutter tonguing, which can be a very tricky thing to explain and teach on the trombone. It's not like single tonguing or double tonguing. So if this is the roof of my mouth and this is the tongue, In a single tongue, it'd be something like da 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 da, or double tonguing da ga da ga da ga da ga da. Flutter tonguing is much different because the tongue has to move really fast. So it should sound like so I don't even like to think about it as, I know it's called flutter tonguing, but I like to think more about how can we use the tongue to create a sound of something that we can relate to. Maybe like the tail of a rattlesnake that's moving really fast. Or the sound of a jackhammer, something like that. Or a deck of cards being shuffled. If you can imitate those sounds with the tongue, you're closer to the sound of flutter tonguing than really trying to approach it like a technique of single tonguing or double tonguing. Now, if I can go back to the analogy of this being the roof of the mouth, and this is the tongue, and it's moving. Unlike in single tonguing or double tonguing, the tongue never goes back to a full resting position. So once it hits the roof of the mouth, it stays up there. And I almost think of like, instead of the floor of it being down here, the floor is about here. So it's bouncing back very quick to the top and the roof of the mouth. Now, what's going to keep that going is the speed of the air. The air has to be moving quickly in order for the tongue to be able to move back and forth really fast. Another thing is the tongue has to be really light. You can't do this with a heavy tongue. So think about if your tongue was really light, and when that airstream crosses over it, it's moving so fast that you can't think about trying to move it. You just have to let it happen. So flutter tongue is a lot about letting it happen, not trying to control the speed of the tongue, and moving that air and letting the velocity of the air really do the work against what's happening with the tongue. So now let's bring that flutter tongue to the horn. And remember, the sound that you want to create without the instrument is something like the tongue is just bouncing off the roof of my mouth really quickly. So with the horn, open horn, it sounds like. Now, the first thing you'll notice is the volume is drastically different between growling, where you were humming, and when you're just using the tongue. You can get a lot more volume out of the horn, which can definitely help you in situations if you have to play over the band or something like that. Even though the sound of these two things are very similar, they're executed quite differently. Now, one of the players that you'll want to check out that use the open horn flutter tongue is Trummy Young. Trummy had one of the nastiest flutter tongues in the history of trombone. So a lot of times when you hear him on these Louis Armstrong recordings, you may hear something like, yeah, that growl, that sound, that's the flutter tongue. You also hear Kid Ory do that too as well, if you want to go a little bit further back in history. Now, of course, you can incorporate some plunger with the flutter tongue, and that's a pretty awesome sound on the trombone. One of the people you want to check out for that sound is the amazing Al Gray. If you listen to some Count Basie big band recordings or some of Al's own recordings, you'll hear him use the plunger and the open horn flutter tongue. Sounds a little bit like this. As you can hear, I can get a lot more volume with the flutter tongue. So this is going to help me if I have to play over a big band or something like that. Now, adding the Pixie Mute can really spice up the sound of the flutter tongue with the plunger. And a few players that you'll want to listen for this sound is definitely Tricky Sam Nanton. He was the father of this. But we also have living legends like Wyclef Gordon and Art Barron, Vince Gardner, Chris Cranshaw to really show us what this sound sounds like in modern times. So here's the Flutter Tongue with just the Pixie Mute. Now when I add the plunger to that, I can get a lot more volume than I could get with the growl. It's a lot different vocal quality than the growl too. So I can definitely play a lot louder with this. Definitely get more volume with that. But with the humming and the growling, it brings a whole different, so I'll play some contrast between the two. So depending on the situation, you can definitely mix up both of those sounds and get a similar effect, but you want to know which one is appropriate for the style of music you're playing and what's going to cut through and really make the horn be heard the most at that particular time. Hopefully these demonstrations and tips will help you out with your flutter tonguing and growling. It's definitely a good tool to have in the tool bag. And if you're in the appropriate musical setting, why not put a little bit of growl or flutter tongue on the note? It might bring a lot of personality to what you're doing. Now, as always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out, and I'll see you next time at the Chop Shop.